Imagine this. It's the summer of 1943 and you're a German soldier. You've been fighting in the desert for 2 years. Salty hard biscuits, bitter substitute coffee, scorching daytime heat, freezing nights, and then, one day, inside a camp mess hall, you see it. A brown liquid inside a glass bottle. Sparkling, carbonated, sweet, a smell you've never known before. Its name sounds strange. Coca-Cola. When you drink it, you're not just drinking a beverage. It feels like touching another world, because this bottle proves something Nazi propaganda insisted was impossible. America is so wealthy that it can afford to give sweetness even to its enemies. Today, I am going to tell you a story. A strange story. The story of an ideology shaken not by bullets, but by ice cream and Coca-Cola. In May 1943, a major turning point occurred on the Tunisian front. Thousands of German and Italian soldiers who had fought in North Africa surrendered. Among them were men who had survived 2 brutal years of desert warfare. They were tough, they were exhausted, but they were prepared for one thing above all else: suffering in captivity. For years, they had been told, America is weak, chaotic, savage. Propaganda had filled them with such fear that being captured felt like the beginning of the end. But the first shock came within hours of surrender. The rations they were given looked like a feast. After months of surviving on minimal supplies, they suddenly found themselves staring at crackers, processed cheese, candy, fruit bars, instant coffee, sugar tablets, and cigarettes. What American soldiers considered boring field ration were treasures to a German soldier fresh from the desert. And these moments mattered, because when your enemy doesn't try to break you through hunger, a dangerous question forms in your mind. What if everything you were told was a lie? Later, one German officer told representatives of the International Red Cross something that carried deep meaning. We expected to starve as prisoners. Instead, the Americans fed us better than our own army. This wasn't just about food, it was a message. A systematic, organized, quiet message. We don't demonstrate power through cruelty, we demonstrate it through organization. And with that message, cracks began to form in the propaganda wall, inside the minds of German prisoners. Now, imagine this. You're a prisoner. You're loaded onto a ship. You're crossing the Atlantic Ocean toward the United States. In Europe, prisoner transport often meant cattle cars, dark, airless, filthy, terrifying. But here, it was different. Thus ships, mass-produced cargo vessels, were transporting thousands of prisoners across the ocean. And the food you received daily was nearly the same as what the crew ate. Bread, meat, vegetables. Coffee with sugar and milk, sometimes even freshly prepared meals. And then comes one of the most unbelievable moments of the entire story. Ice cream. Yes, ice cream. In the middle of a global war, in the middle of the ocean, prisoners of war were sometimes served ice cream. For men who had never seen ice cream before the war, this defied logic entirely. How is this possible? The question didn't come from the mind, it came from the stomach. Because a hungry man knows one rule: when resources are scarce, luxury is the first thing to disappear. But America didn't seem to eliminate luxury. Luxury was ordinary, and that became the second great shock for German prisoners. American industry was so powerful that even in wartime, it had energy to spare for something as unnecessary as ice cream. Arrival at the ports, a lesson in scale. When the ships docked, a new kind of education began. For the first time, German prisoners saw the true scale of America. Vast open spaces, massive warehouses, endless movement on the docks, cargo everywhere, systems everywhere. And then the stores, shelves filled with candy bars, Different brands, endless variety. It looked as if candy wasn't a scarce luxury but an ordinary part of daily life. For a German soldier, this sight was deeply unsettling. In Germany, during the war, sweets and sugar were considered special items. Even when available, they were never accessible to everyone. Here, prisoners watched workers, drivers, ordinary people buy these products with ease. Sometimes they ate half of it and threw the rest away, as if it had no particular value. Scenes like this affected the mind more deeply than ideology ever could, because ideology is built with words, but abundance is seen with the eyes. As prisoners were transported inland to camps, yet another contrast appeared. In Europe, prisoner or cargo transport usually meant rigid freight cars, overcrowding, cold and dampness. Here, however, many prisoners traveled in passenger cars, often with meals, fried chicken, vegetables, pie, coffee. And the strangest part was this. This wasn't a special occasion. This was standard service. Imagine it, you are a prisoner, yet the system moving you operates as if normal life continues. This directly contradicted the Nazi myth that America is chaotic. And now we arrive at Crossville Camp, Tennessee. It was one of the larger prisoner of war camps, and conditions were better than what the Geneva Convention required. Heated barracks, electric lighting, hot water, proper toilets. For a prisoner, this might sound like comfort, but the real impact came from somewhere else entirely. The PX was where prisoners could spend the wages they earned through labor. And on the shelves, the same strange American routine appeared again. Multiple brands of soft drinks, candy bars, snacks, sometimes ice cream, where refrigeration allowed. Tobacco, fresh fruit. Prisoners worked and earned daily wages. And then came the calculation that shocked them most. 5 cents for a Coca-Cola, 5 cents for a candy bar. With a single day's pay, a prisoner could buy an amount of goods that existed far outside the German imagination. And this wasn't just about eating, it was about seeing a system. America appeared to be a place where abundance wasn't reserved for the wealthy alone. It reached everyone, even enemy prisoners. Coca-Cola wasn't just a sweet carbonated drink. It was a symbol because prisoners noticed something remarkable. The same taste, the same bottle, the same standard. Whether in Maine or Texas, it was identical. That meant something important: quality control and industrial coordination. If a country could produce millions of identical products and distribute them everywhere, it was not chaotic, it was organized, powerful, stable. And the Nazi narrative of a disordered America began to dissolve inside that glass bottle. Because in the summer of 1943, inside the camps, it wasn't just Coca-Cola, ice cream, sugar, chocolate, holiday meals. All of it worked together to destroy ideology from the inside. And a terrifying question emerged. If America treats its enemies like this, then who were we really believing in? That Coca-Cola bottle in the German soldier's hand was in reality a weapon, not bullets, not gunpowder, just carbonation and sugar. Yet its impact on ideology could be deeper than artillery fire, because no matter how much people argue, there is something they cannot deny: hunger and fullness, scarcity and abundance. And in the summer of 1943, prisoners in America learned not through speeches but through visible, undeniable abundance. Labor. Outside the camps. Seeing abundance. From the inside, as the war continued, labor shortages inside the United States grew rapidly. Because of this, German prisoners were increasingly sent outside the camps to work. They worked in agriculture, in factories, in food processing plants, in canneries. Now they were no longer just seeing the products, they were seeing how those products were created. In orchards, prisoners picked cherries, bright red cherries destined to sit on top of ice cream sundaes. To Germans, this was absurd. People back home are standing in line for bread, they thought, and here, tons of fruit are grown just to decorate desserts. In canning factories, they encountered another shock. Fruit with minor blemishes, perfectly edible, was rejected because it didn't meet visual standards. It wasn't bad food, it simply wasn't perfect. For German prisoners, this revealed something critical. America didn't just produce a lot, it demanded standards. This was industrial power on an entirely different level. Some prisoners worked near schools. What they saw there left a deep impression. Children were receiving hot meals at school. Milk, protein, vegetables. Sometimes even dessert. In certain places, even ice cream. For a German prisoner, this scene was painful. In Germany, children were growing up in hunger. Here, even children's daily routines included guaranteed nutrition, and this led to a realization. Sometimes, you measure a nation's strength not by its army, but by its school cafeterias. When prisoners worked near towns, they sometimes saw small diners and restaurants. The prices made no sense to them. Hamburgers, that's soft drinks, slices of pie, ice cream, and these meals weren't reserved for the wealthy. Ordinary workers could afford them. More importantly, service was equal. Same chair, same price, same treatment. This didn't reinforce the myth that America is weak. Instead, it raised a different question. How does America work? But the most extraordinary moment was still ahead. After some time, German prisoners began doing something unheard of. Normally, families sent packages to prisoners of war. Here, the opposite happened. German prisoners began sending packages from America to Germany, and this shift struck Nazi ideology at its most vulnerable point. The life. At some point, German prisoners realized something profound. They were no longer just prisoners. They were witnesses. What they had witnessed was not a battle, not a weapon, not a tank. What they had witnessed was abundance, and that abundance slowly, quietly, and irreversibly shattered everything they had believed. Packages sent home. Abundance reaches Germany by late 1943, and throughout 1944, German prisoners began using their wages to purchase American goods and send them home. Chocolate, instant coffee, canned food, sometimes soap, sometimes sugar. When these packages arrived in Germany, families were stunned. People living in freedom were struggling with hunger, while a captured relative was sending food from captivity. This reality alone was devastating to Nazi ideology, because ideology claimed we are strong. The enemy is weak. Reality answered, the enemy feeds you and you feed your family. No poster, no radio broadcast, no speech could erase that contradiction. Yes, the United States had rationing. Yes, Americans complained. But German prisoners quickly understood something crucial. Even American rationing exceeded German scarcity. When Americans said there isn't enough sugar, it meant something very different from Germany's "there is no sugar." When Americans said meat has been reduced, it still exceeded what German families received in an entire month. The difference was not just in quantity, the difference was in the system. America's system was built so that even during war, society did not collapse. Daily life continued. People worked. They hated on children were fed at school, and a clear conclusion formed in the minds of German prisoners. This country fights wars not only with weapons, but with production. As the war neared its end, one final image delivered the heaviest blow. Newsreels and films showed American soldiers in Germany handing out chocolate and chewing gum to German children. Hungry children smiled. These scenes were more than humanitarian moments. They represented total ideological collapse. One regime had promised victory and delivered hunger. The other, even on enemy soil, delivered sweets. German prisoners understood then. The war had not been lost only on the battlefield. It had been lost in worldview. Between 1945 and 1946, German prisoners returned home, and the contrast was brutal. Many prisoners had gained weight in American captivity. They looked healthy. Their families, however, were thin, weak, marked by hunger. No words were needed. The body told the story. Some prisoners brought home their final Red Cross packages. For families, these were treasures: chocolate, coffee, canned goods. For children, they felt like miracles. One sentence captured everything. "My father was a prisoner, and he brought us chocolate." That sentence carried more power than ideology ever could. Years later, many former prisoners repeated the same thought in interviews. The Americans didn't punish us, they shamed us. Not through fear, but through comparison. One system controlled resources and forced deprivation. The other expanded resources and made abundance ordinary. This difference became a crucial lesson for post-war Germany. Many former prisoners later became businessmen, engineers, and politicians in West Germany. They understood something clearly. Prosperity does not come from conquest. Prosperity comes from production, and abundance is the most powerful form of social stability. This thinking helped shape the acceptance of the Marshall Plan, cooperation with the United States, and what later became known as the German economic miracle. Supermarkets, standardized products, mass production, affordable prices. In many ways, these ideas had first been witnessed years earlier inside American prisoner of war camps. Historians note something striking. Former prisoners didn't remember tanks. They remembered their first Coca-Cola, their first ice cream, their first Hershey bar, because taste creates memory, and taste memory is the strongest of all. One veteran later said, "My first Coca-Cola tasted like the future. Sweet, carbonated, and available to everyone." That single sentence summarized an entire ideology. The lesson of this story is simple yet profound. Sometimes you don't need to bomb an ideology. You only need to make it unnecessary. America did not change German prisoners through formal re-education. It simply lived the way it lived. It ate, it produced, it shared, and the enemy saw it. The greatest victories in history are sometimes silent. This was not the sound of gunfire. It was the sound of a spoon scraping ice cream. It was not the rumble of tank tracks. It was the hiss of a Coca-Cola bottle opening. Nazi ideology did not lose to bullets. It lost to abundance. Sweetness, even to its enemies, possesses power far beyond its military. Its power lies in its production, its system, and its freedom. And sometimes, the most powerful weapon is a scoop of ice cream given to an enemy on a hot summer day. What made the American experience so powerful for German prisoners was not any single moment, but repetition. Abundance was not rare. It was not staged. It was not explained. It simply existed. Every meal reinforced the same lesson. Every store shelf repeated the same message. Every ordinary American habit quietly contradicted everything the prisoners had been taught to believe. There was no lecture saying, "This is democracy." There was no sign explaining, "This is freedom. Instead, democracy revealed itself through logistics. Freedom revealed itself through supply chains. Power revealed itself through consistency. And consistency is what ideology struggles most to fight. Psychologists later noted something important about these prisoners' experiences. Humans can endure fear. They can endure violence. They can even endure hunger temporarily, but prolonged exposure to unavoidable contradiction is far more destructive. German prisoners were not forced to abandon their beliefs. Their beliefs simply stopped making sense. How could America be whack if it produced endlessly? How could America be chaotic if everything worked on schedule? How could America be cruel if even prisoners were treated with prisoners? Was that this abundance was not confined to elites. It did not belong only to generals, factory owners, or politicians. It belonged to ordinary people. Truck drivers drank Coca-Cola on breaks. Factory workers bought candy without hesitation. Children wasted food without consequence. This was not because Americans were careless, it was because they could afford to be. And that detail mattered more than any statistic. A system strong enough to tolerate waste is a system operating far beyond survival mode. Before captivity, many German soldiers believed industry was merely a tool of war. In America, they saw something different. Industry was a social foundation. Factories did not only produce weapons, they produced refrigerators, they produced packaging, they produced distribution networks. Cold storage made ice cream possible. Standardization made Coca-Cola identical everywhere. Logistics made abundance predictable. This predictability created trust, and trust is the true currency of stable societies. Food bypasses politics. A speech can be doubted, a statistic can be challenged, a theory can be dismissed, but a full stomach is undeniable. German prisoners did not agree with America at first. They experienced it. 3 meals a day, dessert, snacks, choice. Each bite carried a message more persuasive than propaganda, not because it argued, but because it worked. Perhaps the most devastating aspect of the American experience was comparison. German prisoners knew Germany. They had lived scarcity. They had seen ration cards. They had felt hunger. Now they lived inside a system that functioned differently. The comparison was constant, and it was unavoidable. No ideology survives honest comparison for long. When prisoners returned to Germany, they did not come back as converts. They came back as observers. They did not preach America, they described it. They talked about stores. They talked about food. They talked about factories. They talked about normal life, and these stories spread quietly around kitchen tables, in ruined homes, among families struggling to rebuild. The stories did not sound like propaganda. They sounded like memories. As West Germany began rebuilding, many former prisoners found themselves in positions of influence. They were no longer soldiers. They were planners, managers, engineers. They remembered what they had seen, not slogans, systems. They remembered that abundance could be organized, that efficiency could serve civilians, that production could stabilize society. These lessons did not create democracy, but they made it believable. This is not just a story about the past, it is a lesson about power. True power does not announce itself loudly, it demonstrates reliability. True influence does not demand belief, it earns it through experience. America did not defeat an ideology by arguing against it. It defeated it by functioning better. Weapons end wars. Systems shape peace. Fear can force obedience, but abundance builds loyalty. And sometimes the most decisive victories are not written in battle reports, but in grocery receipts, factory schedules, and empty dessert bowls. Because when people taste a better way of living, no ideology can convince them otherwise.